And for the, oh, okay, I got it. Well, my book isn't an exegesis of Marx. It isn't an interpretation of Marx. It's in the Marxist tradition, but it's a reconstruction of Marx's Capital in, or more broadly, of the Critique of Political Economy, in which I make use of Hegel's logic. Since you've been reading Volume 3, though, I will say, as a kind of prolegomena, something about Marx's own work. Now, Volume 3 is, in fact, from a draft of 1864-65. Now, this is early, and in particular, is before the other volumes that we have. And crucial to the transformation problem is the theory of departments of reproduction. This was Marx's last theoretical innovation, and the Volume 2 text of it that we have comes from as late as 1878 for the most part. So it's well after the discussion in Volume 3 of transformation. And I think this does make some difference. In Volume 3, Marx just throws out a remark in one sentence on page 265, I think, that prices of production must be used in order to give the magnitudes of the cost prices if reproduction is to be treated. But he doesn't go on to treat it. And he clearly doesn't foresee that there would be any problem about doing so. So let's look at the reproduction schemes given to us in Volume 2. Marx blandly says he is going to assume that all departments have the same organic composition. Now, whatever the justification for that simplification, this means there's no discussion of the transformation problem here, or indeed anywhere. If Marx had gone back to redraft Volume 3, he would have been forced to address the question. It's important to see there's nothing much wrong with the transformation procedure that he gives us as such. The criticisms of it all arise from the imposition on it of the schemes of reproduction, and especially the requirement to equalize input and output prices. Hence the notorious complaint that he failed to transform the inputs. So we really haven't got anything to help us from Marx, and we have to do all the work ourselves. And part of my book, I address this issue. Now, in my book, I organized the material of Marx's 3 volumes orthogonally to the order that Marx. Oh, yes, that's the one. Yes, thank you, Andy. But now my face is, oh, yes, my face is up there. Yeah, okay, so you'll see that what I do in my presentation is I present in the order of those box numbers. And in my opinion, this is a way of rising from the abstract to the concrete, which I think is rather better than Marx's organization. Marx's organization goes by the columns, but I go by the rows. Now, what is curious about this, though, is that I do systematically what Marx did historically, in that I come to the transformation procedure in box 6 there, and I do it much as Marx does it. I impose a uniform rate of profit on competing capitals, and I derive production prices in a way similar to Marx. Now, I don't therefore deal with the problem of the reproduction of departments until box 8. In other words, after I've done the transformation procedure in its more abstract form. Now, if Andy could take that away, I'll try and get up the transformation diagram. Can Andy take that away? Yeah. Oh, no, he hasn't yet. Oh, he has. Is this, where's the transformation? Now, can people see that? No? Have I got to share screen again?
Okay, I can do it. Chris.
Oh, there it's up there now. Yeah.
Well done.
I'll move this across here so we can see ourselves. Yeah, so this is my transformation procedure, which is very similar in essence to Marx, but I radically simplify it. I have fixed capital and circulating capital turnover together, and I ignore the fact that there are always going to be different turnover rates. Now, the left-hand side there shows the starting position in which we can see that there are different rates of surplus, sorry, there are the same rates of surplus value, which I've artificially set at 100%, and that this means that the rates of profit are different.
Sorry, Chris.
On the right-hand side,
sorry, Chris. Your sound
after the transformation.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Your sound has gone a bit wavy.
I'm getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable.
Oh.
Will it come back, do you think?
It's fine now.
Okay, shall I just carry on?
Yeah.
Okay, so the left-hand side shows that we start from a position of equality of rates of surplus value, but we end up with rates of profit that are different. On the right-hand side, we impose a rate of profit which is always the same. And I draw attention to the right-hand column that as a consequence of equalizing the profit rate, we have now changed the rate of surplus value. These rates of surplus value, of course, are in money. Now, the physical facts are given as they are on both sides, especially the division of the physical product between the real wage and the surplus product. And the issue is, how does capitalist competition measure those commodity values socially? And how does it generate production prices which are different from simple prices? In the departments of reproduction, I also, like Marx, use a uniform organic composition for simplicity, even though this is counterfactual, just in order to demonstrate what reproduction means, so to speak. It's only in paragraph 83.3 that I finally reach what I call reproduction prices and the general rate of profit. If the departments have different organic compositions and input and output prices are the same, what is consequent? Now, the Sraffians use a system of simultaneous equations, but there's one more unknown than there are equations. So they have to choose a normalization condition, iterative method, by feeding production prices into the system again and again until he reaches asymptotically the same numbers as the Sraffians. Now, the details of all these solutions to the transformation problem are unimportant because all solutions agree that Marx's two conservations cannot both hold together. You notice in this table on the transformation procedure that the profits labeled P1 there add up to 100 on the left-hand side, and the profits on the right-hand side labeled P2 also add up to 100. You'll also notice that the simple prices on the left-hand side add up to 300, and the prices of production on the right-hand side also add up to 300. Now, should this worry us that we can have one of these, according to the people who've written extensively on this, but we can't have both together? You've got to sacrifice one of those conservations if you're going to get at any good ways that those conservations don't hold. Because I think the system of simple prices is completely fictitious. No coherent exchange system could work with them. So it follows that cost prices can't be given on the basis of simple prices. Well, how then are V and C to be determined? Now, at the volume 1 level, they need not be taken as anything other than what capitalists actually pay. That's quite all right for demonstrating on that basis the theory of surplus value. Naturally, it would be good if we could theoretically account for what determines the magnitudes of B and C. And I argue that the finished form of value is reproduction price. So in effect, those B's and C's at the beginning are reproduction prices. But initially, we haven't yet theoretically produced this form. So at the start, they remain undetermined. But once one junks the notion that C and V are in simple prices, the claim Marx fails to transform the inputs drops away. They are always already determined as reproduction prices. In the book, I assume, simply for the purposes of argument, we'll give these reproduction prices. Now, they argue that this means the labour theory of value is redundant or even false. And even in my own presentation, I've argued that that left-hand side has no actuality. So why do I even deal with simple prices if they are, in effect, unactual? Now, methodologically, it's important to grasp the system at different conceptual levels, which recognize in it a hierarchy of determinations. The conceptual levels move in my presentation from an overly abstract view of it to a more concrete one. But even the most abstract picks out a fundamental determination. The whole system is permeated by the struggle of class against class, which determines the split of the output between the real wage and the surplus product. And that fundamental determination should be treated before coming on to the more concrete level in which we look at the way competition between capitals affect the magnitudes of prices. Certainly, the initial level is too abstract for us to be able to read off commodity values. In order to get to the final form of value, which I call reproduction price, all the determinations springing from capitalist competition and the interweaving of the multitude of circuits need to be addressed. So it seems to me that what the neo-Straffians do is completely one-dimensional. They ignore the dynamic of production when they blithely announce that they are considering pricing issues only after the harvest. I've always been struck by that phrase, after the harvest. In other words, they completely ignore the production of the harvest, where most of the interesting things that Marx discusses occur. I think it's useful to distinguish between two senses of determine. One sense means discover. We determine what the prices are, means we are able to read off what the prices are. And the second sense of determine is explain, possibly causally explain even. So thereafter the harvest calculation may well discover what the magnitudes of reproduction prices are. But to explain how these arise, the struggle in production must be addressed, as capital strives to valorize itself through exploiting living labor. So I don't agree at all with the Straffians that the labor theory of value is redundant. And elsewhere in the book, I present my own account of the labor theory of value. Now, if one broadens the discussion a bit, I want to move now to what I say in my chapter called The Dual Ontology of Capital. Because I think one of the main problems that we have, and which gives rise to the transformation problem amongst other things, is that capital functions on two levels simultaneously. It functions at the material level where goods are being produced, labours are being exploited, and so on and so forth. And it operates at an ideal level where values are generated and revaluations occur as we take into account more social determinations. So although I questioned the meaningfulness of simple prices, I accept the great importance of what underlies them, namely the labour times required to produce the wage bundle and the surplus product. The rate of exploitation given in the ratio of labour embodied in surplus, labour embodied, what have I got here? Yes, the ratio of the labour embodied in surplus goods, whether luxuries or capital goods, the ratio of that to the labour embodied in wage goods is prior to and independent of the determination of prices. Even if it were allowable to give simple prices of wage goods and surplus product, it certainly doesn't follow that there's any conservation of the aggregates, because we're dealing with quite different states of the same thing. The first state is determined by the one-dimensional structure of exploitation. The second, two-dimensional state redetermines the first by the impact on it of relations between capitals. Ontologically prior then is the physical mass of wage goods and surplus product. And this mass can't be changed by how it is measured socially. And the social measure isn't in effect demonstrated until we reach the level of reproduction prices. So the dual ontology of capital means that the separation between the material and ideal levels of reality means that the level of the value system is, to some extent, independent of the level, the material level. And when one realizes that there is this duality, it gives rise to two different definitions of necessary and hence surplus labor. One refers to the labor required to produce the real wage bundle. The other refers to the labor yielded to get the money wage. The labor required to produce and the labor yielded to get the wage to purchase that real wage are two different magnitudes. If, for instance, we take the real wage bundle at production prices. So one problem with capital is the way the underlying material reality is obscured by the value system through which capital cognizes it. If the source of surplus value is surplus labor, this qualitative point is obscured by the highly mediated determination of its magnitude and the apparent ratio of exploitation in value terms. That's why it's essential to begin with the elementary capital relation in order to show how the surplus is produced in the struggle of class against class, before addressing the more complicated relations consequent on capitalist competition. In fact, this ontological duality reaches right back to the absenting of use value at the start of the value form dialectic. The two realms interpenetrate such that each movement conditions the other. There's no third to this split between material and ideal. So capitalism is inherently unstable and requires constant fixes to the problems that it throws up. Certainly then, I think there is a problem that the price determinations occlude the fundamental material relation between capital and labor, in which the real wage allocated to labor is a key parameter reproduced by the system. And capital's regime of truth confuses the ideal and material realms. So we must deconstruct this double-sidedness of capital. In the capital system, there's an identity indifference, so to speak, for the same stuff. This physical output is differently form determined when considered in the context of a class relation, when considered as valued ideal actualization through capitalist competition. Certainly, because the system of value and price is exclusively in monetary terms, it makes no sense to refer prices back to some sort of labor values measured in time. However, the monetary realization of value and surplus value doesn't mean that the physical rate of exploitation expressed in virtual labor hours is irrelevant. One last point. No, I think I'll stop there. I think I've spoken for long enough. Do you want me to take down this transformation procedure or leave it up?
Well, if I'm going next, please take it down, because I'll come back to it.
Okay, if I take it down. Yeah.
Well, don't worry, Andy can take over sharing himself, so it should be fine.
No, I lost my screen.
We can see you.
I've got it. I've got it now. I kind of like took it off you.
Okay, so just to say that thank you so much to Chris. That was the comparative statics part of the discussion. We will soon have the discussion with people joining in. So if you want to join the discussion, please raise your hands or get your questions, comments into the chat. So before the discussion, we will now have a 10-minute response to Chris's presentation by Andy Higginbottom. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me this extra time, if you like. And I do appreciate Chris's contribution. I think it's extremely high level of scholarship that he brings, and I think this book does bring something quite original to the debate. So I'm going to say some critical points, but they are in that context overall. Chris has been working on this topic for quite a time. You'll see here something that I actually cited last time I spoke to the group, from an article Chris wrote back in 2005, where he first planted this idea of sort of like a matrix covering the 3 volumes of Capital. And I learned from it. I also think there's a mistake in it, which is highlighted, which is the doesn't bring out the content of volume 1. This row is volume 1 in terms of surplus value. And I'm pleased that Chris corrected that, actually. But what I do like about this structure is this notion of universal, particular, and individuality, or singularity, as is later said. I think that is very useful in understanding the architecture through each of the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. So here we are. If you take the example of volume 1, starts off with a general concept. Once we get into chapter 7, I'm talking about concept of surplus value as such, which is then sort of particularized as absolute and relative surplus value. And then there's a systemic question of how that's converted into capital accumulation. So you have a sort of a social totality in terms of reproduction of a contradictory social relation. So it's very helpful, actually. And Chris argued this in terms of a homology between Capital and science of logic. So then we have, as we've already seen, Chris's developed contribution. And there's a plus here, which is he has, I think, positively gone closer to Marx's content in terms of what's inside the boxes. But I'm afraid it's sort of like 1 step forward, 2 steps back, because I don't agree that I think a lot is lost by changing the sequence of presentation. And I'm going to focus on that in the next slide. But what you can see also, I think, is a couple of mistakes as far as I'm concerned. Organic composition, even in this presentation, doesn't belong here, it belongs here. And what should be here is fixed and circulating capital in volume 2 and turnover. But I also want to draw attention to something else. This column in Chris's presentation corresponds to volume 3 in Marx's Capital. And I just want to highlight something. The content here is about profit, 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 okay? And I also think that in the way Chris presents this, he reintroduces a deep problem with lots of commentary on the transformation problem, which is he reintroduces through a side door, if you like, what's often I would call professional economists also introduce, which is a harmonistic assumption. And the side door is bringing it back to departments of production rather than taking it forward to the contradictions in the general rate of profit. The general rate of profit is a totality of contradictions, and it ends with the two words, hence crisis. There is no sort of imminent crisis except in a very sort of broad and open and undeterminate sense in Chris's argument, whereas there is a sense of crisis imminent in Marx's argument. So I think instead of the full Hegel, we've now got the half Hegel, basically. This is the version that I gave, and I presented this to the group a few weeks ago, actually. And I'm just going to re-emphasize, right, that if you follow Marx's sequence of volume 3, you start off with a conversion of surplus value to profit, you move into the formation of the general rate of profit, and you come to the profit form in crisis. So just emphasizing a point I've already made. And this again, this on the structure of volume 3, it's actually Marx's theory of profit. If volume 1 is Marx's theory of surplus value, volume 3 is Marx's theory of how surplus value becomes profit in the capitalist system. And I keep emphasizing this because it's a really important point, which I think is overlooked, which is surplus value is not identical to profit, not only in magnitude, but in form. It's the relation between the inner and the outer. Okay, so Marx already in volume 1, in chapter 9 of volume 1, Marx distinguishes between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. And he makes a point early on, actually, well before volume 3, that this different way of viewing the relation between capital and labor represents different class standpoints. So the rate of surplus value brings out the class contradiction, whereas the rate of profit hides it. And also in volume 1, in chapter 11, Marx points out that there is a contradiction. He does say there is a transformation problem, in so many words, in volume 1, in the published public version, right? Now, in other words, what I'm saying is that the contradiction does not arise because of capital's in competition. It arises because of the fundamental structural relation between capital and labor. Okay, so you cannot do away with the transformation problem without doing away with the capital-labor relation. The really important point about volume 3, if you like, methodologically, is that he breaks the identity between surplus value and profit. The other thing, finally, just in terms of how Marx positions his argument and why the sequence is important, is volume 3 does not start with the same contradiction of the commodity as volume 1 does. We know volume 1 is about development from exchange value or value and use value. The contradiction of volume 3 is different. It's about the commodity being the product of exploited labor on the one hand, and being the product of capital. In a sense, it's the vehicle for profit on the other. Okay, so there's a movement in the determination of what a commodity is. It's no longer just a value form. It's a form of capital. It's a capital form. And this is the problem that Marx is actually wrestling with. What does this mean for the commodity, that it's a value form as well as a capital form? Okay, now where I agree with Chris, and I do think these are important points to sort of consolidate, and I would like, I welcome them in his argument, right? He's quite right to say that a simple price is a hypothetical. It's sort of like simple reproduction. It's a point of contrast to prices of production. And he's also right that the column, as soon as you think of profit rather than surplus value, or what he calls as surplus value 2, that is a different rate of surplus value than the starting point or the simple rate of surplus value. But also have to say he makes mistakes. And in a way, he sort of inherited the mistakes which are predominate most of the specialist literature, right? This simplification is an oversimplification. It's very important to the solution to maintain a distinction between capital advanced and capital used up. And I'll just jump just at time. Prices of production are a combination of capital used up and capital advanced times the general rate of profit. The only way you can reduce them to capital used up is by a different sort of index, which is markup by sector. So what is very important here is price of production gives no immediate reflection at all of the contribution of living labor. Both elements, cost and profit, are related in the form of appearance to the contribution of capital rather than the contribution of labor, right? So this is not an input-output problem. It's a problem of inner to outer. It's a problem of how the essence actually appears in the capitalist mode of production. And I mean, Chris is not alone in I believe, making this mistake. I mean, I think the mistake goes back a long way. I think it's a misspecification or a wrong turn after Marx, let's put it like that, in terms of, and the only way it works is if it's assumed that exactly, if like contrary to a point Chris made in his presentation, I think we do have to look at how labor time is converted into money. And if you assume that it's a fixed or uniform conversion across the sectors, then you cannot solve the problem. You cannot solve the problem on that premise. However, reality tells us there is a problem. So if as I was saying, if the unlikely is excluded, then you have to deal with the impossible. No, if the impossible is excluded, then you have to deal with the unlikely. And the unlikely outcome is that the monetary equivalent of labor time has to vary by sector. And this is what capital imposes through its differentiation by sector. There is a differential expression of commodity values as prices of production. And that's what displaces the simple exchange values or the simple prices that was referred to. In other words, commodities being capital form displaces them as the elementary value form, okay? Insofar as it equalizes capital rates of profit, the capitalist system spontaneously disequalizes the social recognition of the products of labor. It expresses equal labor times in different amounts of money, i.e. prices. I've got no idea about my 10 minutes, but that's where I'm quite happy to declare a break.
Thanks a lot for keeping to your time, Andy. That's much appreciated. I see John Smith has got his hand up. I'm going to let him in soon. Please get your hands up if you want to join the discussion. But in the meantime, let me allow Chris to spend a couple of minutes responding to Andy.
Yes, a lot of Andy's points are very interesting. But from a philosophical point of view, I have some problems with talk about inner and outer, and some problems about the very similar distinction between essence and appearance. I think Andy even says volume 2 is about appearances. I think that when we deal with this split, however we characterize the split, it's important not to reduce one side to the other, and in particular, not to reduce the ideal magnitudes, as I call them, to the material facts about labor time. And so I don't like talk of inner and outer because it makes it seem as if the outer is less significant, or appearances even less significant than essences. Whereas I would rather want to say that both of these systems have their own effectivity and both interpenetrate in order to produce the reality that we have. I don't see any point in calling the capital system the outer registration of the facts about labor, because it's just as important to the system as the labor inputs. Okay.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we got a couple of speakers now, starting with John Smith.
Hi there, thank you very much. Thanks to both of the presenters. Yeah, my question, I'm just going to ask both presenters to comment on it. And that is, it seems to me that one thing that's really important and is often missed, and I don't think has been brought out, well, I'll just say what I think the issue is, and that is, if we look at the labour process, there are two very different things that occur simultaneously and are often confused. One is that concrete living labour transfers the value contained in the means of production and the materials used up to the new products. And the second very different thing is that abstract labor power creates new value, which is absorbed by the products of labor. And those two things are very fundamentally different. And Marx explains it very clearly in chapter 9 of Capital Volume 1. And we then have, and we need to just reflect on that a minute, first of all, because it means that the rate of surplus value is entirely about the ratio between necessary labor and surplus labor. And Marx explains that the calculation of surplus labor is simply a matter of just adding up how much surplus labor has been actually generated. And it is completely independent of the organic composition of capital, The actual transfer of existing labor by existing labor contained in the raw materials and in the means of production by concrete living labor to the new product, it depends on the rate of, on the organic composition of capital. So a very capital intensive process, the small, relatively small number of living workers that are present, that are taking part in this, will be transferring colossal amounts of already existing labor to the new product. But the amount of abstract surplus value that they will be contributing to be absorbed in the new product will be independent of the organic composition. That is fundamental, and I think it's fundamentally missed and mistaken by the literature that I've looked at, which is nothing like as extensive as it should be, admittedly. Then we have a second level of complication, and that is that the actual values which the workers transfer from the raw materials and the means of production to the new products are transformed, are actually prices of production. But, and this is the most important thing, there is no transformation of the surplus value which they also contribute to the values that they are producing. That is unchanged, that is completely untransformed, and it just emphasizes how fundamentally different the two simultaneous processes of transference of existing value and contribution of new value, and it is the latter which is relevant to the rate of exploitation and the former which is completely irrelevant to it. Maybe I'm slightly overstating the point, but just to really emphasize the difference. Thank you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me because I can't hear anyone else, including Biz.
Sorry, I was mute. Yes, we can hear you.
Right. I'm a latecomer to this discussion in more ways than one. But I agree with Andy that Chris's table and what flows from it provides us with some interesting new ways of thinking about what's going on here. But I've not yet got to grips with the detail of what Chris takes from that. So the point I want to make is rather different concern, and that's in his chapter 14. It's on page 335, where he essentially discusses why he thinks this is important, and he says that the fundamental Marxian theorem that all value arises from the exploitation of labour can be supported only on ontological grounds, not on the claim that labour inputs are the best predictor of empirical prices, for instance. And then he says the exploitation of living labour is the explanation of the genesis of new value. This ontological truth remains fundamental, whatever the price is socially assigned. And that's a bit worrying to me, because, I mean, to put it bluntly, it's seems to veer perilously close to asserting that the labour theory of value is true because it's true. Why is the labour theory of value a good explanation? Well, it provides a successful explanation. It's because it provides successful predictions about the real world. It's certainly not a theory of prices. Marx thought that the importance of it was precisely the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit. And the reason why it's important to defend Marx's transformation problem is because if it can't be defended, then the fall in the rate of profit doesn't logically follow from the rest of Marx's reasoning, and thus the most important conclusion of the book is now left in midair.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Gillian. Okay, so okay, Jeff. Can I leave you till the next round while I get Chris in, and maybe Andy as well. Chris, your response?
Okay, yeah. Well, John Smith's point, oddly enough, is very similar to a point I make in the book. I have a little section on the rationality of the rate of profit, in which I emphasize very strongly that besides the exploitation of labor, which generates new value, capital also has to worry about the recreation of the capital value C. I think it's far too simple, as in most expositions, where they simply say, oh, the C is carried forward. It's not carried forward. The C is completely destroyed. During the production process, there is a recreation of the C, with a quite different material shape. It's no longer in the shape of means of production, it's in the shape of commodity capital. So that's a big worry for capital. How is it going to recreate the C as well as generate surplus value? So I say that when you're looking at that, you might seem to say that the rate of profit is equally as important as the rate of surplus value in order to understand capital's achievement. And it's quite a rational measure of capital's achievement in a way, the rate of profit. With regard to Julian's point, I defend the labour theory of value in a particular way. Most people defend it by seeing something positive about labour, which means that one can attribute to it a particular power of creating value and surplus value. But I have what I call a negative labour theory of value. I have a section in the book called the Dialectic of Negativity. I argue that what is special about labour, which makes it distinct from any other factor of production that might be inputted, is that it is recalcitrant to its exploitation. There may be technical issues, just in time and all the rest of it, but with labour, capital faces a counter subject to itself. You have a subject in the process that is resistant to capital's exploitation of it, maybe actually, or at least potentially, recalcitrant to capital exploitation. Therefore, capital has to force labour to produce. There's a sense in which one could even speak of labour in capital as counterproductive labour. It doesn't want to produce because it doesn't see that there's anything in it for them. So from that point of view, I have that special labour theory of value. Now, of course, I have said, Julian's right, that I don't see any way of getting from labour times through some simple algorithm to prices. But I don't quite grasp why this affects the law of the falling rate of profit, because that's about the increase in the mass of C compared with V, and I've accepted that exploitation of labor is special, and therefore I do agree that the new value can be sourced in some sense from this counterproductive labor. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Andy, would you like to come in here for a few minutes and respond to the discussion so far?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there is a sort of anticipation in John's comments about what we're going to present next, but never mind. But I mean, what connects what John and Julian both said is what I want to come to, but just take Julian's point on its own. I agree with what he's saying, but I would add that Marx doesn't actually fully address the premises of the problem which he sets. If you look at the beginning of volume 3 and you look at what the variables are which will affect the rate of profit, one of them is different rates of surplus value. Now, Marx's solution to the transformation problem is based on a uniform rate of surplus value. It's capitalism in one country. He says that quite explicitly, right? And so his addressing the decline in rate of profit argument is also within that limitation. Now, I think it is beholden on us to rework Marx, including the reality of more oppressed conditions for labor, generating different rates of surplus value, and to rework his argument with that involved. And again, coming to declining rate of profit, but what it brings out much more is the imperialist character of capitalism in terms of, if you like, the counteracting tendencies. So, I mean, I agree with Julian, but a bit more, I would say, right? Now, what connects what John and Julian said is this argument about relative surplus value, right? And it is core to Marx's conception of capitalism that the organic composition of capital will rise, and that this in turn will generate an increase in surplus value for the capitalist class as a whole, insofar as greater productivity of labor affects consumer goods for the working class, right? Now, I disagree with Rutan's understanding of what's going on with the increase in relative surplus value. Chris adopts the point, and he's quite right. He does say it in his book, he's quite right too, that you have to distinguish between the role of labor in creating new value and its role in recreating value. Now, these are not, they are distinct, they're not separate. They're two aspects of the same labor activity. I mean, they're not different things in that sense, right? They're two aspects of the same thing, right? But one is in the realm of use value and one is in the realm of valorization. Now, it's the abstract nature of labor which creates new value. And what Rutan's argument, we'll go into it in a bit more detail. He says, by definition, workers in the high organic composition of capital sectors produce more value than workers in low organic composition of sectors, right? And I disagree with John, completely agree that we should reject that argument. It's a mistaken argument, and we can get more or less technical about it, and I'm quite prepared to do so. But basically, that's, you see, there is a variation from surplus labor, surplus value to profit. In money terms, there's a variation from surplus value to profit by sector, right? So you can explain that two ways, right? You can either say, well, there's more surplus value being produced per worker in the high composition of capital sectors, or you can say, no, there's a different type of conversion. The conversion from surplus value to profit is different by sectors, right? And you can't wish away, I mean, the road forks at that point, basically. And on the third one is you just say, well, there isn't a problem sort of thing, right? Well, there is a problem, right? And Marx doesn't spell out a solution. We can't quote Marx on this. We have different interpretations of Marx on this point, okay? And so it is up to us to finish the job. I say that the equality of capitals renders a necessary inequality in the social recognition of labor, okay? In other words, labor times in the low organic composition of capital sectors aren't given the same recognition in terms of the price of the commodity as labor times in the high organic composition sector capitals. And it's not because they produce less surplus value or less value, it's because there are more workers compared to the capital engaged.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Andy. Okay, so at this point, let's see what's the time now. Okay, I think we can open the floor out again and also pursue those questions that arose from Andy's response and Chris's response. But Jeff's got his hand up, so I'll let him in now. Jeff, you're mute, Jeff.
It's just a general question, really, but it connects to a falling rate of profit. I found it very difficult when reading this book to find a criterion with which to critically assess what I was reading. And the reason, I mean, my normal criterion would be, how does this fit with Marx? He's got Marx wrong here and here and here. And yet that's ruled out by Chris, because at the beginning he says he's not attempting to interpret Marx. Marx is ruled out anyway. He's using Marx's concepts to rewrite an understanding of capital. So in a sense, it's a descant on Marx rather than an interpretation of Marx using the music of Hegel. But it makes it very difficult to come to grips with it. And I feel that what is the consequence of what's happening is that Chris is falling foul of what Marx warned against in the Grundrisse, when Marx said that he wanted to avoid writing a dialectic of concepts by concentrating on the real world. And what I'm reading is an extremely clever and very hard worked and imaginative dialectic of concepts. To give one example of a falling rate of profit, which I read, or I could use others, but the falling rate of profit you set out as a model. And there's no reason why, and you say yourself at the end, there's no reason why the countervailing factors can overcome that tendency. You say that it depends on the empirical world, but it's a trend. It's not necessarily a tendency in the long term for the rate of profit to fall. I can't criticize you apart from saying, well, Marx didn't say that. And of course you say, well, that doesn't matter, I'm saying it. But all I can say is that Marx's criterion is the real world. He's trying to understand what's happening in the capitalist economy, and he sees that as tied to a growing accumulation in crisis which restructures, where capital has got to restructure itself. With you as a systematic dialectic, as you call it, which never comes to ground for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So let's see, where are we? Okay, at this point, I'm going to bring in a quick question from the discussion from someone who actually isn't able to put the question in person, but she's put it on the chat. And it's addressed to Chris and Andy. And it says to Chris, first of all, I'm curious about you reinstating a dualist ontology in this argument, the separation between ideal and actual levels of reality. I always felt Marx's critique of Hegel was a critique of this dualism, including the notion that a pure realm of ideality could impact a realm of pure materiality. After all, if they are distinct ontologically, how do they touch? For Hegel, it was via our connection to participation in God's spirit, of course. Can you talk about why you think this is the correct interpretation of Marx? Okay, and also a little question to Andy here. The point you finish on, are you talking about differential wages? I think she was referring to your first contribution, Andy, so I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll let Chris answer first and then Andy.
Yes, these two questions go to the very heart of what I'm about and why I cannot claim to be an orthodox Marxist. I do not believe that Marx ever managed to sort out for himself why he found himself time after time using Hegelian figures. I think that he was perhaps allergic to Hegel because of the ways in which Hegel had been taken up by the young Hegelians and others in completely fantastical ways. So he, as Jeff says, distinguished between the dialectic of concepts and a study of material reality. And it is always very opaque in Hegel how the realm of ideas is able to mediate itself in nature and history. Now, my solution is pretty startling in that I do not believe that thought is the only realm in which there is a dialectic of concepts. I argue that because of the very peculiar way in which our social practice treats commodities in the exchange process, our practice does itself generate social forms that have a quasi-logical character. So this ideal realm I speak of is not a realm of thought. It's a realm of social forms which have arisen out of material reality, but which have gained autonomy from it, at least in form. So when I deal with value and surplus value and prices and so on, I see these forms standing in logical relations to each other. For example, money stands to commodities in a logical relation. It presents to commodities their universal aspect in an autonomous shape. So I do have a way in which the ideal logical categories and the material reality are able to get into contact with one another, because those ideal forms are, from the beginning, social, practical forms within which we find our own activity determined. I use the expression formally determined. So I say that these ideological forms formally determine practical reality. Most obviously, the drive of capital to accumulate impacts on the production process. But of course, that material reality is equally important, because it's only because workers can produce more than they themselves consume that the whole system can get off the ground at all. So that's what I call the material condition of existence of capital. So I would defend myself on the grounds that I think that concepts and logical relations between concepts are not just in thought, but they also take social form. And that's why capital is so peculiar. And that's why a critique of Hegel is, in a way, a critique of capital, because they've both got the same inverted reality. Hegel thinks that thought supervenes upon material reality. Capital claims that its categories, value, surplus value, profit, and so on, are what the economy is all about, and that labor is merely an agent of the capital concept. I think you'll have to read the book to see just how I managed to support that. And I think a lot of support for my view does rest on the detail. I mean, it's quite common in a certain literature to say that, oh, well, of course, Marx may not have quite realized how Hegelian he was, and has not quite realized that capital is an Hegelian subject. I think you have to go beyond that. You have to show in precise detail how each category of Hegel's logic allows us to understand better the categories of political economy. And that's why there's so much detail in the first part of my book about Hegel's logic, because I think the plausibility of my view does depend on whether it can be worked through in detail.
Thanks a lot, Chris. I'll let Giovanni in now, followed by Sam.
Hi, do you hear me? Because I have
Yes.
okay. Thank you, Chris, for this great presentation. I am connecting with you just said in your answer now, and also in your comment earlier about to Andy, in a way, your criticism on the dichotomy inner outer appearance and reality. Of course, I'm dealing with Marx now, but we know that your theory wants to be an independent, conception. So as far as I totally agree with you about this dichotomy that is forced, and also for Marx, the appearance is really a fundamental level of reality. So we shouldn't really, the word appearance is misleading. But at the same time, because of that, because also of your I think very clear, it's helping me now to understand even better when you speak about how the practice themselves have generated in a sort of immanential transformation, capital as an autonomous subject that, so there is a source in practice, but then of course this autonomous subject that is dominating these practices. So it's very clear. So that's why I feel a bit a contradiction when in some part of your book you speak about false ontology, inversion even, using the Marx language of inversion, these mirror metaphors and so on, word of falsity. So I don't follow you anymore because you are just clarifying us, and I totally agree that it's not a mystification, it's a level of reality, it's a force. It's true that capital is an autonomous subject dominating labor. Labor is reduced to a negation of negation, like you say. So why call it false ontology? It's a perfectly real ontology. There is no inversion because there are just two different forces, but one force, capital, is much more powerful than this residual reaction by labor. So why do you speak about falsity, inversion at all? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Giovanni. Sam?
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a bit of a philosophical question, if you will, to Chris about your about this novel system. And just to orient how I'm going to ask this question is, I'm trying to understand the nature of what you call the analogy between Marx and Hegel, which is what I'm interested in. So as we saw, I followed very well in this transformation problem discussion.
Sam, your sound is
discussion of this dual
Sam, your sound is not working.
And I have to hear me now.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I agree with this dual ontology procedure, but it seems that this dual ontology is somehow rooted in your general idea of capital as a concept, which is inadequate to itself. As in your words, you say it has no truth. And this is connected, it seems, to your critique of Hegel's category of the absolute idea. So prior to this absolute idea in Hegel's Science of Logic, you get the idea of the good, in which the urge of the concept to self-determine or self-know itself is posited as an other to itself. And this to me is connected with the critique of the place of cognition, the role that cognition plays in Hegel's general schema. So if in this sense, in Hegel's idea of the good or absolute idea, his idealism basically means that you make up your mind before you act. And so we get the first act is the absolute idea. In your system, as different from Hegel's, seems to use cognition as the hinge between logic and reality. I think that you use that word, the hinge. So my question is, where in your system do we place cognition, given this critique of Hegel? And is it just like value? Do we find its source in labor? And if that is the case, is there a possibility of this cognition or ideal dimension or that ontology, just like real concrete labor, to have an autonomy from the system so that it's not just an internal aspect of capital relating to itself, but is there a real possibility of its autonomy in the same way that there's a real possibility of labor's autonomy from the system as a real social force?
Thank you, Sam. Okay, Chris, maybe a quick response to Giovanni and Sam.
Well, yes, these are very interesting questions. Yes, it might be that I speak a little hyperbolically when I use all that language about false ontology and so on. I think I say in the last chapter, the false is out there. So I entirely agree that these powers of capital, even if I describe them as ideal powers, are real powers. They actually do affect the opportunities that we have to live. And capital is the overriding power in the modern epoch. You could even say it's the subject of modernity. But although these are real powers, I think that there is still a sense in which one would want to mount a critique of the system, however successful it might seem, because there's always something in excess of the concept. I mean, Hegel tries to show us that the material world, that the social world are simply little more than expressions of the absolute idea developing itself, knowing itself, fulfilling itself. But in the case of nature, it's pretty obvious that there are plenty of things going on in nature which Hegel's logic cannot explain. And it's very much the case, I think, that Marx's critique of Hegel for inverting the true relation between reality and concepts has some purchase. And I think the same is true of our critique of capital. Capital claims to be the creator of itself. It claims in its circuits of reproduction to be able to subsume under its own forms all the economic reality that it comes across. It first of all encounters things like labor, then subsumes it, then transforms it. But there's always something in excess of its concept of itself. And I draw attention to two others of capital that it cannot possibly claim to have absorbed to itself. One is nature, which I call capital's external other, and one is the proletariat, which I call capital's internal other. These are certainly thoroughly transformed by capital, but still stand, as it were, on their own feet and are capable of reacting back upon capital. Nature will react back by causing a gigantic ecological crisis, which will swallow up capital and everybody else. And the proletariat, we hope, will react against its imprisonment by capital by breaking free in some sort of retransformation of reality. So although capital has successfully imposed what I call its regime of truth on the modern world, it is in fact possible for us to criticize it and say, no, fundamentally, what capital is claiming, just as what Hegel is claiming, is a false ontology, pretending that everything can be reduced to ideal social forms. So it is certainly a certain amount of hyperbolic language, but I think it does pick up something.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Could you, I think we're running short of time now. Andy, you had your hand up. Did you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, it's the start of the football season. So I might be playing on away ground as soon as I get into Hegel. I prefer the home ground of Marx, but never mind. I mean, you have to decide whether there's one subject or two. I mean, in declaring an absolute homology with Hegel, absolute idea, self-moving, self-sustaining subject, that's homology. If you say it's analogy, that's not homology, right? It's a deep influence on Marx, but it's not a reflection of Hegel. It's a subsumption of Hegel's categories to the real social relations of the capitalist mode of production. There is the world of difference between saying capital is an Hegelian subject and saying that the relationship between capital and labor is the essential relation of the capitalist mode of production. Because the Hegelian subject in the second interpretation does only appear. It's a false appearance, it's a real appearance. It's not fair to say that I suggested appearance wasn't important, right? But it's a false appearance from the point of view of the class relation with labor. Is the class relation with labor just internal to the subject of capital, or is it itself the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist mode of production? And in reading your work, I would say you've slightly moved from one to the other, but you're still oscillating.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Okay, maybe you can address Andy's point in your closing remarks, Chris. I think we have to move on now to the second part of the discussion. This is about the dynamic treatment of transformation based on Reuton's work. So a quick 10-minute presentation from you, Chris.
Yes, I'll try to be brief. I was very struck by Reuton's work, and I appropriated it in a certain manner. The transformation table that I presented was a comparative statics. On the left-hand side, we have one situation. On the right-hand side, we have another situation. And on the right-hand side, on the far column, I show that as a result of this transformation, although we started with equal rates of surplus value, we've ended up with unequal rates of surplus value. You need to go to the left, whoever's put that up. Oh no, that's not the transformation table, is it? No, the transformation table has a right-hand column in which different rates of surplus value are shown. It's just a matter of elementary manipulation of figures. If you start with equal rates of surplus value and hence unequal rates of profit, when you equalize the rate of profit, inevitably the rate of surplus value is changed. Now, what Reuton does, which is quite clever, I think, is that he says, let's look at this whole thing dynamically. If some particular industry introduces new productive forces that enable it to compete more effectively, even though these new productive forces are more expensive, then for a time at least, there will be extra surplus value accruing to that firm. Now, it's argued usually that that is only temporary, that there's no reason why these new productive forces should not become generalized across the sector. When that happens, therefore, those prices begin to fall. But the point that I take from Reuton is they don't fall back to the original level, because as they are more expensive, as the price falls to the point at which the rate of profit is about to be restored, there will still be a higher rate of surplus value to compensate for the higher C. So entry to the sector dries up once the rate of profit approaches the general rate of profit. So the point that Reuton makes, which I think is very good, is that there is no mechanism whereby more productive forces developed in one sector can become generalized across all sectors. So that higher rate of surplus value will become fixed. It will be always the case that the sectors that have a higher organic composition will ipso facto have higher rates of surplus value. So the sector with a higher productive power generates value at a higher rate than would be the case if value simply reflected the time of production, as if value was always created at the same rate. So in advanced sectors, the rate of surplus value is higher, even if, because of a concomitant increase in organic composition, the rate of profit is the same as everybody else's. So at a material level, an increase in the productive power of capital is registered in an increase of the output of use values per day. And the point at issue is whether this simply means the same value is spread over this greater mass of use values, or whether in some fashion a permanent increase in value arises from production of a higher power than before. Although the innovating capitalist loses much of his advantage as competitors in the same sector initiate the new productive forces, there can be no process of imitation that's necessarily effective across sectors. Rather, what happens is that in the case where the increased productive power is not costless, but linked to a higher capital composition, then a new rate of profit ensues, which retains within its generality a higher rate of profit for the innovative sector. Even if the average rate of surplus value increases through the generation of relative surplus value, the traditional sectors are penalized through a lower than average rate. If we take the rate of surplus value to rest on the rate of exploitation, it's true that this monetary revaluation of the rate of surplus value leaves untouched what we might call the physical rate of exploitation. But in money terms, the rate of exploitation has indeed changed. Now, I differ from Reuten in one respect, in that I, in my treatment, speak about the productive power of capital generating a higher rate of surplus value. Reuten's defense of the labor theory of value rests on the idea of a positive concept of labor as the only active factor in production. So he sees this increased productive power as the increased productive power of labor. Now it's armed with superior productive forces. So I think that is interesting, because what Reuten emphasizes is that by looking at it this way, he's completely got rid of all the talk of redistributing surplus value, all the talk of even distributing surplus value from an aggregate surplus value. Now each capital does create its own surplus value, but some do it at a higher rate than others in order to compensate for their higher organic composition of capital. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Okay, so okay, let's have a quick response from Andy now.
Okay, I want to share my screen. Hopefully, this will work.
Oh, sorry. Do I need to stop sharing?
Well, I'm not sure. I would like to share.
I think you have permission to share screen. Participants have permission.
Okay, thank you. You can see it, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Where are we? Quickly. Yeah. So I'll get there. I've got there now. Right. I mean, yes, that is this idea that there are two rates of surplus value. Okay. There is the consequence to this, which is well sort of normally held by a lot of what I call a Eurocentric strand of Marxism, which is that workers in high organic composition sectors produce more surplus value. And that means that they're more exploited. Some people say technically more exploited. Now, I think Chris's points are well made, that it is very important to distinguish between the role of labor in creating new value and its role in recreating existing value. But I think he's mistaken in deploying that distinction to support the Reuten thesis, right? There is no necessity to, one can accept that workers in higher composition sectors recreate more existing value, but it needs to be a different argument to be made that they create more new value. Okay, in other words, there's no particular reason to assume that just because they recreate more value, that they would also create more new value. I think it's a point that John was also making, right? The further differentiation must be made about how commodity values appear as exchange values, right? And this does go back to the point I've been sort of knocking away at, because again, Chris is talking about surplus value, where actually he's talking about profit, okay? And that's the point, that what the capitalist gets is a money profit, which you can put as a ratio over the variable capital over the wages, but it's not the surplus value, it's the profit as it's a realized surplus value, right? So there, the surplus value as the necessary labor times and surplus labor times over necessary labor times are expressed differently, because the commodity exchange values are no longer directly proportional to the labor expended, but they're regulated in proportion to the capital advanced. So it's the disguise of the contribution of labor, distortion from the content to the form, if you prefer, rather than in and outer, is complete. And that's how it's done, right? I mean, not how it's done, but that's the point, right? The profit per worker is not surplus value. The profit per worker in a sector is the realized or appropriated form of surplus value. And so what you're talking about is a different ratio, which is profit over variable capital, not S surplus value over variable capital. And that P over V ratio depends entirely on the capital advanced in that sector. It's not even an issue of organic composition in that sense. It's purely a matter of how much capital has been advanced in the sector. Now, the only issue to really sort of work out, retain, is that S over V is therefore is not spectral, it's real, because it does obtain, and Chris kind of like accepts the point in the way he's put it, and it's slightly different, right? The overall class struggle does determine the ratio of surplus labor over variable capital, if you like, but it doesn't determine it at the level of any given sector. I think Reuten's position is a reflection of a trade consciousness rather than a union consciousness. I put it like that, right? And I think it gives a theoretical justification for quite wrong political positions. It doesn't mean itself, it means it's wrong, but I'm just saying that beware of what the consequences are, right? Because what it does is, when you amplify it, it explains unequal international exchange purely from the point of view of higher or lower organic compositions of capital, right? Now, I think that there is it's quite cute what Reuten does, but he doesn't actually sustain his argument, right? The only place, it's interesting, he actually doesn't deal with where Marx deals with this, right? Marx actually deals with this.
Andy, could you start winding up, please? Thank you.
Okay, all right, I'll start winding up, right? The dual ontology is a false appearance against the essence, okay? And I just ask these questions. Where are the majority of the workers in this multi-sector system, right? What is the tendency of capital accumulation in the low organic composition of capital sectors? And what are the implications of sector differentiation for workers, for the unity of the working class?
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so we'll have two speakers, Pritam and Walter. And I'm not sure we'll have time for any others, but over to you, Pritam.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, Biss, for organizing this, and Chris and Andy to make the presentations. I must apologize in advance about the remark which I'm going to make, that I haven't been participating in the discussions on Capital Volume 3. I read Capital Volume 3 earlier, another group with Biss, and so my comment might seem a bit out of place. But I want to start by saying that what I'm going to say is a starting point in my own thinking about Marx's Capital. That I think that there is a kind of consensus, despite the fact that there is a difference between Chris and Andy, and even the remarks made by others, including Jeff, that capitalism is regulated by the logic of rate of profit. That capitalism as a mode of production, the logic of the capitalist mode of production is determined by the rate of profit. And that logic then translates into business behavior of each individual firm. Now it's on this, I think that it does not square up with the actual empirical work which is being done on business behavior. The studies on business behavior, any one of you who would be familiar with those studies show that businesses actually do not always aim at rate of profit maximization. Various studies show that sometimes they aim at sales maximization, sometimes they aim at sales revenue maximization, sometimes they aim at capturing a bigger market share of a certain market. And in doing this, they are willing to have a lower rate of production, lower rate of profit. Not only low rate of profit, they might even have a loss. That one monopoly wants to eliminate the other monopoly. Say, for example, Tesco wants to eliminate Sainsbury. They might actually reduce the prices. They might actually incur losses. And they might be aiming at a 10-year strategy in which to capture the entire market. Now, one might say that eventually even that is determined by capturing the market and then exploiting the market for rate of profit. It's true that the ultimate aim may be aimed at rate of profit, even if in the intermediate stages, it's sales maximization or sales revenue maximization or market share. But the question is that even if it's 10 years, then within 10 years, lots of things might happen. So the first point I want to make is that we need to start questioning this idea that rate of profit determines the business behavior of modern corporations at an individual level. Okay, so that's kind of one point. The second is that the idea of the declining rate of profit.
Sorry, Pritam, you've got half a minute. Okay.
Okay. Maybe I'll just finish it here.
Okay, thank you for your consideration, Pritam. Sorry to rush you, but okay. So Walter Down.
Hi, I'm looking at Chris's transformation procedure table, and I find he says there that the transformation due to the equalization of profit rates produces different rates of surplus value. And I disagree with that way of looking at it. I think I'm just repeating a point that Andy has made in perhaps different words. The rate of surplus value is based on the value produced. And after the transformation, each capital's ratio of S over V is based on the value that it captures, not what's produced in that sector. So that it's an illusion that there's a different rate of surplus value or a higher rate of surplus value in the more productive sectors. Andy has pointed, and John Smith also have pointed out that in reality, that is in the reality of the imperialist world we live in, there are indeed different rates of surplus value, but those are based on value produced, not just value extracted or captured. It's essentially because some workers, especially those in the global south, but not exclusively, are woefully underpaid in comparison with the wage achieved in the global north. So there does in reality exist tremendous differences in the rates of exploitation, but they are not created by the tendency for the profit rates to equalize. If I have another minute,
Okay.
Marx himself, in effect, created an illusion that rates of profit are higher in the most advanced sectors, because when he deals historically, let's say with one capitalist country, let us say Britain over a period of 20 years in the 19th century, because the productivity advances, the rate of exploitation has increased. So the more advanced Britain has a higher rate of exploitation than the previously less advanced Britain. But that is not at all the case. That comparison over time is not at all the case in the comparison over space that we're dealing with in the real world, where the rates of exploitation, the workers in India and China are not about to become the most highly paid, equal to the most highly paid workers in the global north. And so it's not something that happens. It's a difference that exists and that is built into the imperialist system. And that's a
Could
point.
you start winding up now, please?
I'll stop right there.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry about that. Okay, John, a quick comment.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, it's just the.
Sorry, you're mute again.
Oh, there, yes. It's just the point that it's much more than semantics, and we can get confused by this. When living labor transfers the already existing value contained in the raw materials and means of production to the new product, it is transferring dead labor to dead labor. There is no creation of new value taking place here. To talk about destroying the value that exists and then recreating it as if the worker is actually creating the value that he or she destroys. Marx never talks about this. He talks about transfers of value through production it talks about transfers of value, living labor, concrete living labor. That's the use value of labor, transferring the values which already exist into the new commodities, into the product. But it's not a process of creation. The process of creation is of the abstract surplus labor creates new value. And the two things are fundamentally different, and they are being confused here. And that is why it seems to me this is bourgeois economics dressed up in Marx's terminology, because it confuses use value and exchange value. It confuses dead labor and living labor. This is the very barbaric notion that Marx talks about in chapter 9. And it's a bit shocking, and I know it's provocative to say this, but that's how it seems to me.
So yeah, we've had quite a few good points there. So let me now invite Chris to respond to the whole discussion or to the points he thinks are most relevant.
Yes, there are quite a lot of good points there. Maybe I just go backwards. No, I'll go forwards. The first point to which I don't think I've been able to respond said, what about the role of cognition in my system? Well, Hegel understands cognition as the process whereby the concept is able to come to terms with reality, either through theoretically interpreting it or even through practically transforming it. So my analogy with that is, in effect, using Marx's concept of subsumption. What capital has to do once it's achieved some sort of conceptual development is to address reality in such a manner as to inform it with its concerns. So it knows reality in the sense that it imposes on reality the system of value, and it transforms reality insofar as it subsumes the labor process under its dictates. So when I do my analogy with cognition, I'm not really addressing any social agent's knowledge of reality. I'm simply addressing the way capital has to appropriate reality under its abstract forms. Now, another point which Andy made, which I just want to touch on is that in my section on recreation, I do one thing. In my section on the dynamic theory of transformation, I do something else. I don't, in effect, ever ask the question, how do these two things relate? Andy thinks they should be related, and I agree with him, they should be related, but I just didn't do it in the book. So I don't know as yet how I would approach the question of how the recreation stuff affects the writing stuff. Now, with respect to the argument that only new value is created, I am quite conscious of the fact that I am diverging from Marx here. Marx does say that the worker, besides generating new value, transfers the value of the means of production used up to the product. And I am questioning that, and I'm saying, no, it's not just a simple question of an accounting identity between a C over here and a C over there. There is a real job to be done in turning one set of material factors, machines and raw materials, into commodities fit for sale. And that, in effect, as I see it, means destroying the values that appear as inputs and recreating equivalent values as outputs. I agree these are two different things, i.e. the creation of new value and the recreation of old value, but I still think it's an interesting way of looking at it. Now, I certainly don't want to get into any argument to the effect that workers in advanced countries are more exploited than others. And I entirely take the criticisms of Eurocommunism, the criticisms of the people who don't understand imperialism properly. And I accept them because I'm simply drawing attention to money rates of surplus value. And money rates of surplus value are in effect negotiated between capitals. And I don't think that touches on the actual experience of workers in their place of work. I mean, people in call centers would certainly experience exploitation without question. But as I say, I don't go directly from a claim about money rates of surplus value differing to a claim about material rates of exploitation differing. That's as many points as I can remember.
Do I have a couple of minutes?
Yeah.
Bis, you're on mute.
Thanks, Andy. Sorry, Michael, could you just expand on the point you made there about how living labor and the means of production continues the labor expended on them? Michael, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, am I here?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I wasn't really, I was just siding with opposing this recreation talk since I think it's, but I mean, there's so many things going on, I'm out of my depth, but since, I mean, it's very clear that the fundamental phenomenon is that, you know, there's all this work going on. And you know, there's a kind of cut. So now there's means of production have been produced, so to speak, and now that same work is continued, and we get, let's say, a final good. I mean, or whatever you want to call it. So it seems to me this is really fundamental to the whole picture of the transfer of the value of the means of production to the finished product, so the value of the product. It's because it's just the continuation. The easier way to see this is the many places where he imagines a form of production, you know, starting with whatever means of production and a final product, dividing in two. So the former partial product, you know, become, so to speak, independent, you know. I mean, it's discovered that, you know, oh, we can sell this partial product to some other jokers or whatever. So we have now two companies. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter. And then, sorry, so it just split, but the basic phenomenon is it just splits in two. So now the partial product is a commodity, which is bought as means of production, and then finished by the rest of what used to be one company, so to speak, right? I mean, this for Marx is not this. I think this is sort of fundamental. I mean, for him, I think he's always thinking of this. I mean, it's just, you know, kind of a nicety where in the total process of, you know, reproduction and so on and so forth, the nodes where we get the commodity form sold as means of production, the nodes in the development of means of production toward whatever final consumption that's not to be I feel so. I just don't think there's this creation and recreation. There's just continuing, I mean, like, as if one was saying that in the workshop, no one thinks that in the factory with a long production process, the partial product is destroyed. I mean, or the work on that as it comes up to the partial product is somehow destroyed and used by the rest of the work that finishes the product. You know what I'm saying? Sorry, there's this obvious unities there, and that's what's going on. Sorry.
Thanks, Michael. A quick response, Chris.
Well, I have to think about those points that Michael made. I haven't got a ready response.
Oh, okay, great. Okay. Well, I think we've only got 3 minutes left, so I might as well call the discussion. Sorry, Andy. Okay, quickly.
Yeah, just 2 minutes. I mean, if you look at volume 1, Marx does deal with this in a lot of detail, actually, and he plays with different verbs. He actually does say it's not a simple transfer. He says, he actually uses a word, I can't remember the exact word in English translation, but he uses a term reincarnation. It's effectively reincarnation. And what he's talking about are the use values, really. The use values are reincarnated. If you think of a chemical works or something like that, okay. So, I mean, it is constant capital. So the value is the same. But so Marx is quite careful about that. He actually says that during the working day, the new value reproduces the value of labor power, but doesn't reproduce the value of the means of production.
Okay. Can
please just give me one more minute, right?
Okay, 1 minute.
Which is that all surplus value is money. Sorry, that's completely wrong to emphasize money surplus value compared to material surplus value, right? Surplus value is in terms of money, right? The distinction has to go to the question of profit. What's the difference between the profit form in money and surplus value? Okay, and that is a distinction which basically Chris doesn't tackle.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Final response, Chris, 1 minute.
Well, I certainly agree that moving from surplus values to profit is much more than a question of manipulating some numbers. It's a different social form entirely, the capital form. When that comes on the scene, gives us an entirely different view of what's going on in production than we get if we just attend to rates of surplus value. So I hope I didn't conflate these in my book or in my remarks, because I certainly shouldn't have done.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, it only remains for me to thank Chris Arthur for his explanation of this issue, which has bedeviled discussion about Marx for so many decades. Thanks to Andy Higginbottom for his cogent responses, helpful criticisms. I'm sure Chris's much-awaited book will be widely read and hotly debated, and hopefully will play a part in theoretically arming new generations in the struggle against capital. Thank you to all the other speakers and our other guests. You're welcome to join our reading group either regularly every week, or if you just want to take part in a discussion about a particular chapter. We've currently just reached the end of part 3, and Michael will give us a presentation on Commercial Capital chapter 16 next week. So I'm really looking forward to that. Just pasting the social media details of the links for our social media groups for our group if you haven't joined already. And I think I'll stop the recording now.